Hi guys, good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to today's virtual forum in collaboration with BSI, Jitsuin and Device Authority. My name is Daniel Phillips, CEO here at Industry IoT, Industry IoT being the organizer of the event today in collaboration with our good friends here with me on the screen. As you can see, the theme of the session is understanding the evolving risk and security challenges in industrial IoT. In a second, I'll hand over to John, who will be the moderator, shed a little bit more light on the topic and introduce his fellow speakers and panelists. John is currently the Global Practice Lead for OT and IoT security at BSI. And I will now hand over to him to get into the introductions. Over to you, John.
Yeah, thank you so much, and welcome from the good morning section of the world, 9 a.m. here for over in the States, but happy to have everyone on and be working with this wonderful group. Joining me today is Isabel Forkin. Isabel is with BSI. She's the head of our cyber lab and is joining us. We're going to be talking a lot about assurance and digital trust and how to go and how to achieve that and understand those in your environments. Rob Brown, the VP of Marketing and the co-founder of Jitsuin, is going to be joining us. Rob knows more about SBOMs than any person I've ever had the pleasure of talking to. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about the SBOMs from him and the executive orders and all the work that has gone into that and making those so you can meet the United States executive orders, but then also how organizations can use SBOMs and use it in their environments and help them understand their risk better with the use of that SBOM. And then also joining us is Rob Dobson, the Vice President of Technology and Partners for Device Authority. Device Authority is a partner of BSI, and we're happy to work with Rob and his team. We've done a couple joint presentations, but when we're talking about IoT security, Device Authority is one of our go-tos. So really happy to have Device Authority here with us today to talk about, this IoT risk world. And the usage of IoT is growing and increasing across the world and across multiple markets and in lots of areas, from everything from industrial IoT to the medical IoT. Farming is using IoT. Tractors are becoming IoT endpoints that are driving themselves effectively. So IoT is everywhere. It's in our food supply chain. It's in our logistics supply chain. It's involved in manufacturing. It's involved in medical, building management. IoT touches everything. In your house right now, if you're working from home like most of us, I have an IoT oven, so I can turn my oven on and start preheating it right now and get ready to cook. You all have IoT devices all over your house, whether you realize it or not, whether they're connected and working all that well or secure. So it's a part of life that touches all of us. It's a technology that's in front of all of us. So really happy to have this conversation and get talking to it today. We're going to start out with a little bit of a presentation or first part by Isabel Forkin, and we'll go from there. And we're going to get towards the end. We'll wrap up, and if you've got questions, go ahead and submit them through the chat, but then we'll have a roundtable open discussion type section between all of us on the board, answering questions that have come in and getting to talk through some of those things. So with all that said, Isabel, over to you.
Thanks very much, John. So the overall talk is about risk, how it's managed, and how the SBOM plays into that piece. But before we get into the weeds, into the details, I wanted to talk about kind of the why of it all, right? Like, why is it important that we do this? Because I think sometimes we jump into the middle, and without understanding the why, we don't understand the how as well as we can do, and the real benefits of things like continuous assurance. So the first thing I want to talk about actually is this idea of assurance, right? Like we say this word a lot, but I think it's really important to have a clear idea of what that means for us. We talk about assurance, but what we really mean is, to my mind, it's about trust and confidence. So when we say security assurance, system security assurance, what we mean is, does this system kind of have the level of security that we think that it does? And can we trust in this system to do the things that it's supposed to, and to not do the things it's not supposed to? And for me, we use this word assurance, but it's understanding the underneath and the things that sit underneath that. And in my mind, assurance kind of, I've got these 3 blocks. Obviously, it's much more complicated than that in reality. But to my mind, there's sort of 3 real big things that you need. The first one is like, how secure do you want to be? You know, like that's the biggest question. Like, how much do you actually care? And of course, there's a whole section of our industry that sits behind that. And then the other 2 pieces that fit into that are what can affect how secure you are, those threats and external factors, and then how secure the system actually is in reality. And you need all those 3 elements to really know if you're meeting the level of trust that you actually want to achieve. And the way that this works in my experience is that these all change. They're like, this is a constant sort of changing equilibrium. So your external factors change. So maybe you just need to change your requirements. You know, some new legislation comes in, so you need to be slightly more secure. Or, you know, some external factors happen and, you know, there's a greater threat out there. Let's say there's a significant world power doing some stuff they shouldn't do. And actually you want to stay just as secure. So that means that you have to change your systems to account for that increase in the threat. And in my mind, I see this as sort of like a constantly changing set of set of, in my mind, they're columns. But yeah, it's constantly changing, and that's the real trick that we play as security professionals, and then as the C-suite, feeding into that and understanding, you know, what you care about, and what that level of security is, and then working with the security professionals to then be able to say, well, okay, what are the outside things that we care about? How does the system work? And creating that balance. Next slide, please. So what I want to talk about specifically today is vulnerabilities, because I think that is potentially some of the more interesting areas, and where we do have these different things kind of competing and kind of changing each other. What I think we kind of get wrong sometimes about assurance is that we don't think enough about the external. And especially when it comes to vulnerabilities and vulnerability management, we, especially in the assurance world, I think we tend to think, okay, this is our level that we require, this is our benchmark of security configuration or whatever, and we'll do an annual pen test. And it's only on that annual pen test or annual review that we go, oh no, there are more things that are creating greater risks. Let's address them then. And I think we get that, not everyone, of course, but I think it's easy for people to get that wrong and only look internally at how secure do I need to be and how secure do I think my systems are, and not necessarily take into account that, like, actually, how's the world changed? Again, like this week, that becomes really quite relevant of, you know, actually the rest of the world is changing how you need to secure your systems to maintain that level of security. And, you know, that's why we care about, for example, secure by design, which I know John's going to talk about in a moment. You know, that feeds into that because, you know, vulnerabilities being discovered actually kind of starts way back when you start designing and creating those systems, and trying to make them as secure as possible to begin with, so that external, actually a vulnerability has been created, doesn't happen as often. But so for me, that's why this concept of continual assurance becomes really important. And there's 2 facets to that. One is making sure that you're continually checking your systems, and the other is making sure that the thing that you're checking them against is actually an accurate representation of the external. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So I want to compare to what I'm going to call point in time assessments, and I've kind of kept this purposefully quite generic, but we can see that what happens is we have a desired level of assurance, as in a level of trust, an amount that we believe that our systems are secure based on whatever our definition is. And we test and we have a really high level of confidence, never 100%, of course, but we have this high level of confidence. And then as time goes by, the outside world changes, and potentially the system change as well. And what happens is that confidence erodes. And at a certain point, you get below your trust level. It's been so long that actually you can't trust in what the output of that test is. You have to test again. You test again and it goes up, and then it erodes down as time passes. And this is kind of what we get with the point in time assessments, which is the more traditional kind of classic security methodology, I suppose you would call it. That works for systems that don't change very often. It works for environments that don't change very often as well, to some extent, but it is flawed. We go to the next slide. So when we talk about continuous assessment, I mean, ultimately you're still checking something, and you're checking it with a frequency. And I know Rob and Rob will get into this later on, but what it means is that top up is happening so frequently that it is effectively continuously allowing you to increase your trust level in the system, and it is adjusted for what's happening globally and what's happening kind of particularly vulnerability wise externally, and it just means that you kind of get this little uptick of like, actually yes, you can be confident, actually yes, you can be confident on a regular enough basis that your continuous assessment actually translates to what we would call a continuous assurance, and continuous trust, I suppose, is sort of the way that I would put that. I think I'm going to hand over now, I think, to John, but hopefully that's a good kind of background in like why we care about this, why we want to do continuous assessment, and how everything that sits underneath that kind of slots in to that overarching strategy of trust in your systems.
Yeah, thanks, Isabel. And I think it's wonderful to talk about the desired level of assurance or desired level of trust, or even start to think about it as desired level of security. How reliable does this device need to be for you? What's the uptime requirements of it? What's its production requirements? And as we start to talk about that, it naturally leads into that secure by design discussion about how do you put these devices into your network in a secure way so you can make sure that when there is a vulnerability, that vulnerability is already as mitigated as it can be, but also you've got an architecture that can deal with vulnerabilities, that can have additional controls put into place to protect those. So as we talk about that continuous assurance, in order to maintain a continuous assurance, you need a secure design. So let's talk about the two different types of designs that have been used in the past, or the two different ways that you can design for cybersecurity. And we'll talk about the traditional design. Traditional design looks at your functional requirements of the system. Maybe you need to do a temperature monitoring inside of a room. So you have a functional requirement for temperature monitoring. Project ideation comes in, we start talking about how often do we need to measure the temperature, what's the range that it needs to go inside of, how accurate does that measurement need to be, how often do we need to pull these devices in and get that information. You get all those requirements together and you go into project execution. You create maybe you create an RFP to go out and search for IoT devices for temperature monitoring, or you go to Amazon and you buy something that's appropriate for you. There's a lot of different ways to go about acquiring IoT, large project, small project, point in time, everything, right? And then it flows into operations. The problem is you solved your functional requirement. You now have temperature monitoring for this room, but you have a very low trust temperature monitoring of this system, because in the traditional method where you solve the problem that you have in front of you, as an engineer will do, I have to monitor these temperatures. Get a thermometer, I can monitor the temperatures, but I didn't build any trust into this system. So we'd start our day with low trust, as opposed to secure by design. Secure by design starts the exact same way. You've got functional requirements. We're going to monitor temperatures in this room. We need to define new operational risks that come about because we're going to be using a smart device to monitor this temperature. What are those new operational risks? Well, if that remote monitor, temperature monitor were to go down, you would have lost visibility to the temperature in that room. And because you went to remote monitoring, maybe you don't have the staff that can walk around and manually record temperatures anymore. Maybe that system that was used to manually record temperatures has been defunded and decommissioned and it's no longer around. So because we use technology, we by default increase the risk, because a human walking from point to point is not going to get hit by malware and be unable to walk from point to point and record things. We've introduced new risks because of technology, always. So the next step is define our trust requirements. What's that minimal level of assurance that we need to have? And once we define those trust requirements, this device needs to be online. It needs 5 nines of reliability. It always needs to be there. This device needs to be able to function even in the event of a network broadcast storm. It's got some sort of third-party way to get it out, because we really need this to go in. So it's got a network connection and a cellular modem connection. So we know we can always connect to it. It's never going to become invisible, right? We're going to define those requirements that are required, that are needed to secure this device and keep this system as trustworthy as possible. Now we're going to go into product ideation. We start ideation with all of our security requirements, all of our functional requirements. Now we can go into project ideation. Then we can flow into execution. Then we can flow into operations. And then, by the way, we flow into lifecycle management. How do we maintain trust in the system? How do we do that continual assurance like Isabel was talking about? How do we keep an eye on everything that's going on? And how do we eventually retire this device when it's no longer supported and can no longer be maintained by a vendor or by the organization itself? So when we go by the secure by design, we start day one in a high trust system. And anyone who's worked in security and who's in this OT world, IoT world, that's tried to do security after the fact, you've got the system that was built in 2006 when we weren't talking about all these security requirements, and you try to bolt security on after the fact. It's an incredibly daunting task. But starting from a greenfield, when the project just starts, you put your security requirements in from the front. It's actually much easier to have a secure system at the end of it, and you'll likely save money just by moving to the left of the project with security, moving trust to the left of the project. Before ideation, trust is talked about, and we understand how to do it. The risk is tracked, it's managed, and it's addressed throughout the entire project lifecycle, from that requirements gathering all the way to retirement of the system and how you lifecycle management out of your environment. You've got a clear roadmap of trust that you're able to go through. I always like to talk about the human factor. I think the human factor is huge in this. Anything in this world that I can do that reduces my stress and lets me sleep better at night is an activity that I quickly take upon. So let's look at traditional design versus secure by design. An example for Log4j or Log4j, or however it is pronounced. And the reason I picked this one, and I think it's important to highlight, 4 days after Log4j was announced, Cloudflare was seeing 24,642 attempts to compromise Log4j per minute. 24,000 per minute. At that pace, the entirety of the internet can be scanned in 90 days. That's every IPv4 address can be scanned for Log4j in just under 90 days. So you've got 100% chance of being scanned within 90 days, but a 33% chance of being scanned within 30 days. You don't have a long time to act when vulnerability announcements like this come out that are easily used to compromise systems, easily used to get into there. So let's look at the day in the life of a person, your IT manager, your OT manager, your engineers, whoever's in charge of it. Let's look at what their day looks like when Log4j comes out. Traditional design, right? They receive notice of the vulnerability. If you're in the IT world, you heard about Log4j. You're now going to go, well, what vendors are using Log4j? Well, it's kind of hard to find out, right? So you're going to hope that a vendor notifies you. You're going to do some research online to find ones that are published that have Log4j. But ultimately, you're trusting that the vendor is going to notify you of it, or that you're going to be able to find the vendor's notification. That vendor might not even exist anymore to give you notification. You're going to start racing to find vulnerable devices before the attackers can, because like I said, you got a 30% chance of getting scanned within 30 days based off of just Cloudflare's data. You're going to scramble to find patching methods because you've never talked about how to maintain these things. Lifecycle management isn't part of IoT's DNA typically. So at the end of the day, you're unsure of the risk. And if you're worried about security, you're not sleeping well tonight. You've got a very hard next couple days or next couple months. So let's look about secure by design. I received notice of a vulnerability. We're going to go back and reference our SBOM for usage of Log4j, right? And we're going to talk about SBOMs in a little bit, but that SBOM, boy, does it help you sleep at night. If you're able to quickly find whether or not you're vulnerable to something, you can, oh man, Log4j, it's nowhere in my environment. That sounds like it's a bad day for a lot of other people, but my day's done, I'm good, right? Maybe we have it. We're going to take a look at our risk ranking for affected devices. We understood the risk of all of them during project ideation, so we understand the risk of those devices. When there's vulnerabilities, what the outcome of those vulnerabilities could be if this device were to become unavailable. We're going to enable additional security when applicable. We already know where this thing lives in the design. We followed a secure by design principle. We designed the risk, so we made sure that the protections were in place to support the level of risk that this device is supposed to see. So we're able to put in additional security features just based off of that we use secure architecture. And then we're able to enact our patching plan to mitigate, because again, in front of this project, we talked about the risk. We recorded a patching plan. Every device that we purchased, we understood how it was going to be patched, how it was going to be maintained. That life cycle management was dealt with and talked about before you even went through ideation. So this is all just normal day. It's bad. Log4j is, you're hoping, you still have to wait for vendors to issue patches for you to truly clear these out, but you're able to understand your risk quickly, assess how risky this is for you, and then quickly take those actions. Versus traditional design, it's really kind of a hope and wait and see. And boy, I sure hope we got it right, because there's really, as we get into there, it's difficult. And I'm sure everyone who's on this call has faced this before. You get notice of a vulnerability. It's making the news everywhere. NotPetya hit and wiped out so many things. Oh my goodness, am I vulnerable to this? And how much time and effort did we spend trying to find out if we were vulnerable versus taking action to protect? The less time we can spend researching if we're vulnerable, the more time we can spend taking action to protect. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to the executive order from May 2021, talking about zero trust, SBOMs, and collaboration. So
thank you, John.
Yep.
And thanks for the introduction as well. You're very kind to say I'm very knowledgeable, but it's just that you haven't met more knowledgeable people about SBOMs just yet. so yeah, Jitsuin's company, we've been around since 2018. We originally set out to solve the challenge of life cycle management of connected things, because there's huge challenges in knowing who did what when to a connected thing that ultimately tell you whether you can trust the data coming from a device itself. And, we've all got to rely upon that data to make smart decisions about, if the thermostat is telling you to cool the room, then you really should cool the room, and it's not somebody trying to trick you to do the wrong thing. So along came the executive order last year, which was, a gift to us, because it actually crystallizes a lot of the thinking that we've been doing in the secure lifecycle space of connected machines and software. And the executive order is fantastic. If you haven't read it in full, I'd recommend you just go and read it. It's not that tricky a document to get through, which is surprising for a government issued document. But there's three things that really stood out in that executive order for me. The move to zero trust, and always verify, never trust. And effectively that means continuous assurance. The call for software bills of materials and increased transparency in what software federal government customers are using and what risks they're importing into their organizations, and a need for better collaboration and information sharing amongst all the actors that ultimately secure software and connected things. So our involvement here is that we've built a platform that helps people collaborate and share information and life cycle events on all kinds of things, not just software. Last year, we had a project with Sellafield in the UK to help them track and trace nuclear waste. And it turns out there's a lot in common with nuclear waste and software. Well, three things in common. they're shipped in containers and you can't tell what's in them. You say they're opaque. And software is shipped in containers. You don't know what's in it. So to know what's in it, you need to have a manifest or a software bill of materials that tells you who did what when, who filled it, who made the box, where did it come from, what's inside it, where's it got to go, how's it got to be processed. All of those things are metadata around that asset that you need to track and trace. And the third thing is that they got in common is our platform called Archivist can track both of them, software and nuclear waste. But there is one critical difference. One's more dangerous than the other. And software actually gets worse over time if you don't maintain it. Nuclear waste decays. So, software, it's nice to have this graph that you've got of decay of trust, but it's worse than that actually. All it takes is for somebody else to find a vulnerability and for them to either tell you or not. And that can happen at any time. It's not predictable. It doesn't decay naturally. So yeah, the need for continuous assurance is there. So on the next slide, what this executive order set forth is a number of activities for the US agencies to make some definitions and get the industry aligned. And what followed was NIST defined what is critical software. And they define that as anything that is privileged. And if it goes down, it can severely impact your operations. So the critical software kind of categories and definitions were then identified as identity and access credentialing systems, operating systems, hypervisors, network systems, systems monitoring, all of the critical software that is you need to have trust in for your operations. And it's those critical software packages that need to provide an SBOM. So the NTIA set out to define the minimum requirements of an SBOM, and there are 7 fields that are the minimum, and there are 3 different standards that you can make an SBOM to, SWID, Cyclone DX, and SPDX. NIST then went on to produce preliminary guidance as to what sort of artifacts you should place alongside the SBOM. How do you attest to secure software development practices? But where all of this is leading to is later on this year, SBOMs are going to be asked for in government contracts. So if you're supplying any of these software components to federal government customers, listed as critical, you've got to provide the software bill of materials as well. On to the next slide. There's a lot of jobs to be done. And you might just think, well, okay, I just make an SBOM and publish it. Right, job done. It's not that simple. And for many reasons, you don't want to reveal the SBOM to the world as soon as you've made a software release available. Let's take, for example, medical devices that have to go through months of certifications before they're allowed to be used in operational settings. If that release has got information about what potential vulnerabilities have been fixed, and your attackers know that it's 6 months until that patch can be applied, there's an open attack window. So you want to be able to control who gets to see the SBOM and when. This is responsible disclosure. So the software publisher will have jobs to do to build the SBOM. They will use SBOMs in their build processes while they're building software and checking dependencies that they use, because most organizations are using open source and pulling in components and checking licenses. And there's a lot of tools out there in development pipelines that will generate SBOMs already. The next stage is making that SBOM trustworthy enough for somebody else to consume and understand what risks they're importing into their organization. So the missing piece here has been getting SBOMs from one organization's trust boundary to another organization so that they can trust it and rely upon it. So that comes down to attestation and controlling who has access to it, but also on the other side of the fence, when you're using SBOMs, finding them. So imagine a federal government customer with all of those critical software categories that they've got to now get the SBOMs from their vendors. They could be looking for hundreds, possibly thousands of SBOMs, and how are they going to get them and manage that process? If every single supplier has a different method of sending it and a different format, some attach an email and send it, some put it in a Dropbox. Well, that means that the federal government customers are going to need SBOM departments. Nobody's going to be hiring SBOM departments, and it's a complete waste of time. The SBOM has to be put through an automated system that and enables automated discovery, because otherwise it just won't work for people, and it won't work in the sort of timeframes that they need to work at the speed at which software gets updated. So they're going to need to be able to find how to get SBOMs and even find how to get privately shared SBOMs as well. Making that easy for them is going to be paramount, because ultimately what this has got to do is get an SBOM into an organization to help drive a critical decision, such as if a connected device is now telling me the room is too cold, turn on the heating, can you then check the device posture at that instant and decide whether you put that in special measures or you believe that message at face value and do something about it? Because that's ultimately what we're trying to do, is get towards zero trust connected things. So zero trust has been this concept that's been talked about a lot for identification of people and employees and customers. And actually what we need to get towards is zero trust things, where you continuously authenticate and authorize connected machines. I'm going to hand over to Rob, who'll talk more about that.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, John, if we could go to the next slide, that'd be great. So just before we get into this, so we are Rob Dobson, Device Authority. We focus around identity access management platform for IoT called Keyscaler, and we've done a lot in the sort of industrial, medical, and automotive spaces around that machine identity management, key management, and so forth. And SBOM just a lead on from that, so to speak. And then zero trust is very, very interesting topic, and I know Rob sort of touched on this, and it's very, very pertinent around IoT, especially when you think about some of the devices you might want to connect in this IoT type arena. I pulled this slide here from Microsoft. Never trust, always verify is the sort of mantra around the zero trust ethos, if you like. And equally, this applies for IoT devices. You can see here we've got identity endpoints, data, apps, infrastructure, and network. Equally, devices or things, if you like, play an important part in this whole story. You can just look at sort of some of the things I've got down here. So verify explicitly, always authenticate and authorize based on available data point. Rob touched on that previously. It's all about that ongoing continuous authentication and only authorize authenticated devices to your infrastructure. Use least privileged access only just in time to those network infrastructure pieces, and have a risk-based adaptive policies to support that. Equally, IoT plays in that space, right? You have to have this type of approach. And assume a breach. Well, we've seen many examples of where breaches have come in there, and you need to think about how you minimize the blast radius, segment access, verify into encryption, and so forth. So it's all about that. Never trust, always verify. And I think it's really important to extend that to IoT. That, specifically when you think about IoT devices, they sit typically outside the enterprise, not inside the sort of typical enterprise perimeter. Can we go to the next slide, please, John? So, this, when you think about it, there's been a big change from IoT to OT, or at least I think there has. And why zero trust is coming through here, and why we're talking today about continuous assurance. Typical IT type of devices or equipment, like you can see on the screen here, sort of PCs, computers, iPads, or whatever it may be, they are all typically, a low assurance, or have been low assurance type of devices where, security's been an afterthought, right? You buy one of these pieces of equipment, the IT guys stick it on your network, and then they want to monitor it or detect it. and respond if there's a known threat happen to that device. And a lot of these devices are very disparate, right, in the distributed systems. So typically can be bought from many different vendors, carry different operating systems and so forth. And the way that these are managed are through a manual type of approach, because it's all about how do I get a user onto this network and issue out with a password, a username and password and so forth. Whereas you look at something like these high assurance devices that we talk about, so things that might be assisted robots inside theaters, or could be vehicles, or it could be industrial equipment, or dare I say it, equipment connected to oil pipelines. But typically when you're talking about those type of IoT devices connected in that type of environment, they are things that can cause injury and fatality, that they need to be a very high IP protection and privacy model against, because these devices can be used in a way which is yielding very insensitive information, perhaps factory setting where they're pulling off information about what's happening in the factory. So it requires a very different security model, if you like. If you look at the cybersecurity framework from NIST, we tend to think about these things working in that protect bubble. So you have to think about secure by design and resilience by design from the outset, because of all the things I just talked about, from privacy, safety, and so forth that goes with it. And equally, when we talk about IoT, the sheer scale of IoT, right, as everyone, all the analysts and stuff talk about, requires you to have an automated approach. You can't go for these manual processes and procedures around onboarding a device and then managing those your laptops and so forth, because IoT devices are very different. A lot of them are dumb, so you can't use username and password, and they require an automated approach to manage them and the credentials to those devices. So hence the OT piece. Can we go to the next slide, please, John? So I know we've been talking about the SBOM piece, and I want to get into a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. But if you look at the security challenges from a holistic point of view, we've got the ever-evolving legislation on the right-hand side here, which is where the SBOM piece feeds into, and of course the SBOM requirements are driving some of the challenges here as well. But equally, you look at the sort of landscape around the security challenges. You've got things like the device identity model. There's no real proven identity model. You've got the traditional IT systems which rely on username, password, second factor authentication, and so forth. But you can't apply a lot of those security controls to IoT, because the devices are dumb. You need to have a robust, very strong device-centric identity model to support those devices, because they sit outside the typical enterprise. Equally, end-to-end data security is really, really important for a lot of customers, and providing that end-to-end data security at scale is fundamentally a requirement, especially in regulated environments, which has a requirement to meet certain compliance needs. And equally, as we all know, encryption is easy, but providing keys and managing the keys around that is fundamentally a difficult challenge to do. You can't have security level identity as a new perimeter. I think kind of touched a little bit on this. Your corporate enterprise where you've got all your IT equipment is great, but these devices typically can sit outside of those corporate networks and rely on having a robust identity model and a robust way to manage those identities, because they sit outside those this enterprise firewall and so forth. Equally, applications and device trust is really important, because all these devices have to feed to something, right? They all feed to an application ultimately, and you got bad data going in, you get bad data going out. So you need to be able to trust these devices and trust the data coming off of them. Secure updates is a fundamental requirement for, everything you do from a connected device. If you can't patch a device, what do you do about it? If you find a zero-day vulnerability, you have to be able to update these devices. Otherwise, you're vulnerable for there evermore. And so I think customers tend to find there's a problem around how do I trust the software getting onto those devices in the first place, and how do I build a solution to help me deliver these updates in a secure manner so I can trust them. And I guess the last piece here is around lifecycle management. Given the ability to provide a mechanism to update devices, manage keys, credentials, machine identities, and so forth through a device's lifecycle is important. You can't just onboard a device and forget about it these days. You have to be able to monitor and manage these things from an ongoing basis and to give continuous assurance around these things. So that gives a little bit of flavor about some of the other challenges in IoT security. Can we move to the next slide, please, John? So let's sort of look at some of the jobs. I know Rob talked about the jobs from an SBOM point of view. I want to just drill into what we think are some of the jobs needed for zero trust things and how you might be able to meet this executive order. So if you need to look at the cybersecurity framework from NIST, it talks about identify, protect, respond, and recovery, and having a requirement to mitigate risk on an ongoing, recurring basis is a fundamental need for the EO. And underpinning all of this is utilizing SBOMs to enforce this zero trust approach, and having some kind of authoritative guardian to help defend against compromised or rogue devices is a really, really important aspect to meet this EO and to provide this zero trust continuous assurance approach. So some of the jobs here we've got, is things like having a regular authentication attestation of those devices, to be able to build trust into those devices from the outset and giving that ongoing trust through your lifetime of your device. Authorization control devices to your infrastructure. Again, how do you control authorization into that infrastructure? Critical devices feed into these types of infrastructure, so it's key to understand that. Continuous assurance and to give visibility, integrity, provenance, and governance about what's connected to my infrastructure and how can I manage that and give that visibility to whoever needs to know about it. Detecting device change anomalies. What if my SBOM on my device, what if the software has changed and it shouldn't have changed? I want to be able to detect that that's changed and be able to provide visibility about that's changed. Because if you don't know that it hasn't changed, then you don't know what's happening with your real estate devices. You can't do anything about it. And that feeds on to the next one is remediation, right? So if something has changed on your edge devices, you might want to do something about it. One thing could be to trigger an update, say, hey, right, a zero-day vulnerability has been found. I need to force an update on my devices. I've got a patch to fix that. Or it could be that something's changed on my device. The firmware has changed. It's not as it should be. I might want to remediate and take that device offline. But maybe revoke a credential, for example. And then, the app integration automation piece is really, really important from that standpoint. Is how do you automate that for IoT? Because we all know that the scale there is, it's huge, right? Typically, so having the automation into your IoT applications to remediate is fundamentally important. And equally, the last point here is having that machine identity issuance and management at scale, because a lot of these devices, as I say, tie back to an IoT application. Typically, all of them do, and a lot of them rely on X509 certificates, some on tokens, and having the way to issue out these machine identities at scale in a secure way is a fundamental requirement how you can build out this continuous assurance zero trust approach through this automated sort of solution. Yeah, that's sort of the key, some of the fundamental jobs we see needing for the EO. John, do you want to move to the next slide? So I think the next two slides are the sort of the last ones I've got here, but talking about what we can do from an SBOM continuous assurance approach. And this sort of paints the top level picture. And we've got a number of key things here, all the way from the top, number 1, 2, 3, and 4. So one here is in those blue boxes, really like some of the initial things you might want to think about and do. So for example, I've got a device and I need to get an agent on board so that I can communicate to my identity access management platform, my guardian, if you like, which is connected to an SBOM hub. So then, we also need to publish the SBOM to our SBOM hub so we can give visibility to the various government vendors in that space. You need to have visibility around what software is on critical infrastructure solutions. So having that visibility into an SBOM hub, being able to publish that. And then there's the risk analysis piece. So being able to certify that, yeah, this device has got this version of software running on it. It's got these CVEs against it, and the risk analysis is X. And yeah, we're good to go. Then I guess these orange pieces here is then plugging into the enterprise and then being able to establish and manage that risk on an ongoing basis, giving that continuous assurance, right? So being able to gather and update the SBOM data in the hub on an ongoing basis. Perhaps a 0-day vulnerability be found. Okay, we need to apply this to all the software I have in my data hub and figure out which ones are vulnerable on an ongoing basis, and provide visibility and compliance about what those that software is and what's been updated and so forth. And I guess the three here is around that remediation control and how you remediate into your IoT applications. Perhaps you want to be able to revoke a credential that's your device is used to connect to your backend cloud infrastructure. So you might want to have some policy controls to say, hey, if this device fails to validate its SBOM, current SBOM on the device against what's known good, then you might want to remediate and say, hey, perhaps I want to trigger an update, or do I want to send an alert, or do I want to revoke a credential so it can't connect to my backend infrastructure. But all of this leads to a solution that helps give that zero trust continuous assurance approach to help meet this SBOM executive order from the US, and providing the governance, provenance, integrity, and compliance ultimately that's needed in this space. I guess I'll just move into the next slide, please, John. I'll just give you a practical example here, and some actually work we've been doing with Jitsuin around zero trust, SBOM, and continuous assurance. So you've got in the middle here, you've got identity access management for IoT. We have a platform called Keyscaler can help you with that. Jitsuin have their SBOM data hub, which can help provide a way to give that data assurance, visibility, transparency through the supply chain about what's in your devices. And I'll talk through the flows here. So initially, obviously, the device maker would publish their SBOM to the data assurance hub. Rob touched on the tools that can help you do that through Cyclone DX, SPDX, and so forth. And then equally, number two then is to have the software supply chain security risk and intelligence, where something like BSI can help you then understand what the vulnerabilities are on your devices, the risk posture of those devices through that given software, and so forth. And then number three then is obviously the device manufacturer can then provision our agent or software onto that edge device. And again, that can be done as a retrofit brownfield deployment. So if you've got legacy devices out there, it doesn't have to be through the manufacturing flow. It can actually be through an established maintenance program or patch schedule. You could deploy our software to this. So then once the device is provisioned, we've got the SBOM in the data hub, we can then, the device can basically register to the Keyscaler platform or identity access management platform, authenticate and connect. And then through policy, you can specify, say, hey, with this device connected, I now want to report the SBOM and validate the SBOM against what's in the archivist data hub. So through doing that, through step 5 and 6, we're validating that actually what's on the device is actually what's in the SBOM data hub. And then through that if you like, the intelligence decision making, you can then decide through policy, say, right, okay, well, the SBOM's good, fine, we're all good, we can continue as normal. But equally, if the SBOM validation fails, you could then revoke the credential to take the device offline, or you could enforce an update, or you could send an alert to somebody, say, hey, I'll need to do something about this device. Equally, if you've got a 0-day vulnerability and you want to take all the devices offline, using this type of approach, you can enforce that at scale without having to touch every single device. And I mean, it sort of gives you a little bit of a flavor about what we can do and what type of approach is required to meet this executive order. And actually what we've been doing jointly with BSI and Jitsuin around that zero trust and continuous assurance. John, I think we're moving to the next slide, which actually I think we're moving on to the panel discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rob and Isabel, for the talk that you've done. We've had a lot of questions flowing in. So, excuse me, please keep having the questions come in. I'm going to pull from some of these and we'll go into more of a panel type discussion. So with that said, I'm going to close out the presentation and you can just we'll go back to just the view. Hang on. Stop So yeah, sorry. After all these 3 years of working from home, I should know Zoom a little bit better, but I find myself in Microsoft Teams much more often. So one of the first questions that came in, and it was really kind of almost directed at me, is secure by design is a wonderful vision, a lot easier to deploy in a greenfield plant where you're starting from a blank canvas. But the real world is not ideal with 10,000s of brownfield sites across the world and the massive legacy problem that goes with that. How can the world bridge the gap in the meantime when a control system lifecycle can be 20 to 30 years? And that's a fantastic question and a fantastic problem that every industry has been having to deal with as it matures and goes through the life cycle of we weren't security aware and now we are security aware. And I kind of pulled back to when I was in the electric utility space here in the United States when NERC SIP came out. So NERC is National Electric Reliability Corporation. SIP is Critical Infrastructure Protection. So these were the cybersecurity requirements for the grid operators if you were a generation or transmission electric utility. And so I was around as the 5th version of NERC SIP came live, and we went from the 3rd version and we skipped right over the 4th version and went straight to the 5th. And we all of a sudden devices had requirements for cybersecurity that they are patched, that they're maintained, that they're inventoried, that you have user authentication on them. All these requirements came forth, and it was amazing that 4 months before these requirements came out, if you asked the vendors for patches, they would tell you can't patch this equipment. If you ask the vendors to, stronger password requirements, they said, well, we can't do that. The code's not maintained. Then the ruling came out and every vendor could be patched. Every vendor could have long passwords and strong AAA requirements put on top of them. And the industry overnight all the vendors came on board. Yes, cybersecurity is super important because they wanted to continue selling. And that's really what forced their hand. So how do we go back into this brownfield now where we're told these are unpatchable or we can't put these additional security controls in place? Yeah, real challenge. I would encourage folks to take a look back if you had ideation around when that device was purchased and put in place. If you're a Six Sigma shop and you followed Six Sigma process, you should have that documentation, or your project management process. If you're an ITIL shop or whatever, you should hopefully you have some project documentation around ideation. And the reason I want that is because you got to take the steps backwards that we did in security by design. And now we need to do, okay, what are the security requirements of this device? What's the risk appetite that we have that is appropriate for this device? You have to do it after the fact. It's harder, but you do have to go back and get this information recorded. And once you understand the risk profile, once you understand the acceptable downtimes or how protected this device needs to be, now you can start looking at the security controls that you can put in place. And Device Authority has help for you on that, putting those in after the fact, whether it's brownfield, greenfield, they can help on that side. There's architectural changes you can make, but that's why I push so hard. And it's funny, I had a conversation with a coworker this morning. We've been talking cybersecurity in our areas for 10 years, and it feels like we still say the same things we said 10 years ago. Bring security in early. Don't buy systems that can't be maintained. Force your vendors to provide better, more secure solutions. Make it part of the selection criteria. Cybersecurity requirements should be in your RFPs. They should be in your procurement requirements. You should have contract language laid in around it for everything that you buy. At this point, it's irresponsible to not follow cybersecurity requirements at inception and try to do it after the fact. It's 2022. No one doesn't know you shouldn't do security anymore. So it's not acceptable. It's not an excuse. And let's avoid more brownfields. Let's avoid more difficulty getting into this area. Let's just avoid this situation we put ourselves into. We can do better moving forward. And we understand we got to go a step backwards and have the hard work of getting into those brownfields. But today's the day to take that action. Today's the day to start looking. Today's the day to make sure that the next thing you buy isn't going to become the next security problem for you. With that said, there was a great question that also came in, and I'll pass this over to you, Rob, from Jitsuin. What about SBOMs and devices that are no longer supported?
Yeah, good question. Well, who would have produced the SBOM in the first place, right? they probably wouldn't. But what we do know is that there are companies out there that can generate SBOMs from binaries. So actually reversing the binary of that software, that firmware, and then working out what's actually inside that legacy device can create an SBOM. That's kind of interesting, because now you've got visibility of what's in the device, and now you can better understand the risk of continuing to use that device and whether you should still use that device or take it off the network and look at alternatives. So yeah, there are ways in which you could generate an SBOM for devices that have gone outside their support window. But I think this kind of speaks to this other point about secure by design, which is, well, to be secure by design, you've got to have lifetime support for the device. As long as that device is in operation, it should be supported, because try as you might to build that thing secure right at the beginning and shift all of it left and do all of the great security stuff that you can do down in the processor architecture and the hardware security and then the software security. It's only going to be secure until it isn't. Somebody very clever will find a way into that device because they like a challenge, and that's what motivates them. And when they find that vulnerability, the question is, are they going to tell you, or are they going to tell somebody else who can make some more money out of it? That's the reality. So if you've got a connected device and you're buying something, then a commitment of support is a must. That is secure by design. If you don't have support, it isn't secure by design.
Yeah, Isabel, I think it was you and I were having a conversation, and you said something that is just stuck in my mind. Every device has a vulnerability. We just haven't found it yet. Is that? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point. The reason why secure by design kind of doesn't exactly work in my mind is because it's done by humans, and humans are fallible, and we're always going to be. And yeah, like every device probably has something in there. There is a way into everything, and it's about how we manage it, and how we judge the level of security. Versus how secure we need to be, how secure we want to be. Sort of to that point, I wanted to pick up on something you just said, which is this idea of reverse engineering the binary so that you can find out what's in there. And I thought that was really interesting, kind of connecting the dots a little bit to during your presentation, you're talking about actually some of that information is quite sensitive. And the data that's in the SBOM needs to be protected. But actually, that's really interesting. If somebody has a copy of your software, actually, they presumably, I don't want to say anybody could, but it's not impossible that whoever really, really wanted to find out actually could find out that information. And I think my question almost to you, Rob, or whoever wants to jump in is, does that actually mean that we need to protect the information in the SBOM if you can kind of find it out anyway?
Well, yeah, I think it should be protected for responsible disclosure, but also the arguments about not producing an SBOM because it might reveal secrets. Well, the attackers don't care. They haven't signed a license agreement, and they're not adhering to it. They will reverse it. They will find out. And the SBOM here is about, I've heard it spoken of before, is about creating a roadmap for the defenders, because the defenders haven't got this information to hand because of commercial agreements or what have you, and they're in the dark. But the attackers aren't. The attackers can reverse engineer because they're not contractually constrained. So this is about actually helping the defenders level the playing field.
Yeah, I like that perspective. I think that's really quite interesting.
I'm gonna take a step back from this conversation. I think a great question came in that, and Rob from Device, I'll have you start out on this one. Who ultimately is responsible for the security of your IoT devices? Is it your vendors? Is it maybe it's your consultants? Is it your organization yourself? Is it your IT team? Is it your engineering team who needed that? Who owns responsibility over this?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, ultimately, when we get involved with vendors, it's typically the vendors where they're owning the security posture for their end devices. And that feeds all the way through, right? So it's not just one particular vendor. You know, when you talk about SBOMs, it's going to be an interesting one when the day comes when on the supplier check sheet, you're going to have an SBOM on the tick sheet, right? Because unless you've got that security control in place, you're not going to be selected for your end, you know, for that end solution, right? Ultimately, but ultimately it boils down to, you know, it goes down to the CEOs and the owners of the businesses, because they have to be compliant to meet these specific requirements. Look at the SBOM requirement, right? You know, when it goes into actual ratification and is going to be in law, you're going to have to build a solution to meet the executive order, right? So the CEOs that push solutions out there or feeding in solutions to those end critical infrastructure projects, they're going to have to meet this executive order, otherwise you're going to get some kind of fine moving further down the line, right? So it's weighing up those pros and cons. And I think actually, I'm sorry, I might be getting off on a little bit of a tangent, the insurance businesses and stuff are going to play an important role in this, because ultimately when you talk about IoT deployments and any kind of solution, there's an insurance play here, right? So unless you've got that tick box done, your insurance premium is going to be very high. But ultimately, back to the question, is all about everyone plays a role in that whole security chain. It's about who owns it, because ultimately it's the owner of the security solution at the end, right? If you're a medical manufacturer and you're providing a service to a hospital, those are the guys that are going to get a spanking. They get it.
It's worth a question of asking, well, who actually owns an internet connected thing? Do you actually own everything in it? If you've bought it, no. There's stuff in there that doesn't belong to you. You've just merely got a license to use it. So all of the intellectual property and the processors and the software and everything that's gone into that device is actually owned by somebody else. So
I think a great example, you think about your iPhone. I'm an iPhone user. Everything that I have installed from the Apple iStore, Apple can remove from my device at any time that they want to. Even software I've paid for inside of the Apple Store can be removed from my phone and unpublished at their discretion. I have no say over this. That is true not just on your iPhone. And I don't think people realize that as much. You may own the device, but because of licensing, rarely do you own or have any rights to the software, the firmware, or how that device functions. You purchased a device and the rights to use a device, but you don't truly own it in the classic sense of ownership.
Yep. So I think there is a notion of multiple identities of all of the actors that have got that device to you, for you to use, still having a continuous relationship with that device as it goes through its lifetime, and there will be security requirements on all of those actors to keep the device secure throughout its life.
So that's a really, really interesting point there, Rob, as well, because when we talk to automotive manufacturers and some of the vendors that feed into, you know, vehicle subsystems like TCUs and things like that, when you talk about the life cycle of an automotive vehicle, it doesn't just sit with one owner, right? So these TCUs and ECUs that connect to the backend cloud applications, they have to be keyed every time they change from one owner to another owner to another owner to another owner to maintain the integrity of the vehicle data coming off it that's tied to that specific owner. So that in itself is a challenge, just talking about one thing now, right? So it's an interesting topic, that ownership transfer piece.
And when we talk about the ownership of that risk, that becomes, again, more complex because you have that extra layer underneath, which is kind of the consumer. And actually, they're, you know, it's their data, it's their whatever, but really it's probably the layer above them that is responsible for either doing or assuring the security of the rest of the system.
Yeah.
And I think as consumers, we kind of just hope and trust, but mostly hope. I think the businesses we buy our stuff from are doing the right stuff.
Yeah, and the way I like to think about it, ultimately the risk is owned by whoever needs that system to be operational. If we go back to my monitoring the temperature of a room, if you are the engineer who's in charge of that room has to be at 5% humidity and at sorry for Fahrenheit, 70 degrees Fahrenheit at all times, right? If you're the engineer whose primary responsibility is keeping that room at that temperature and there's an IoT device involved with doing it, you had better understand and be able to deal with the risks that come in with you. You can't hope your cybersecurity department's going to do it for you, because your cybersecurity department doesn't want to own any risk whatsoever. CISOs, the chief information security officers of the world, have learned owning risk equals losing job. So they will do everything they can to notify risk owners of the risks that they have, but the security department's not going to be taking on those risks anymore. It's not even appropriate for most organizations. So if you're the engineer, if you're the person who ultimately owns what that thing is providing, you have to own that risk ultimately. And to steal a term, the buck has to stop with you. You have to put it in. You're the one who has to put the foot down and say, this thing needs to be secured. You may not know how to secure it. That's fine. There's other people who can help you with that, but you own that risk. You own that uptime. In my, in my world and where I come from. This kind of feeds into another great question that came in here. And I'll tell a little bit of a story. Most recently, before I worked at BSI, I was working for the Department of Defense in their National Center for Cybersecurity and Manufacturing. So I was the director of cyber for the Department of Defense's manufacturing security arm. And we talk to the defense industrial base all the time. Some 198,000 companies in America are part of the defense industrial base as manufacturers. Of those 198,000 of them, I think it's 95% are considered small businesses, which means they have 50 employees or less. So the average IT spend at those 198,000 companies involved with the defense industrial base that are classified as small, somewhere around $3,000 to $4,000 per year on IT, not security. $3,000 to $4,000 per year on IT. And the question that came in is, how can a small level startup with a low budget assure the security and timely testing of the systems? How do we do this affordably? How do we go about this and biting this? It's an elephant of a risk. So how do we start taking small bites off of, how do we make this affordable, or how do we explain it to, it may not be, you're spending $3,000 per year right now. In order to do business, you're just going to have to spend more. So how do we keep this affordable? How do we keep this in front of the people who truly need it and truly are they're the bottom of the supply chain. And we've seen the bottom of the supply chain can make the top of the supply chain fall over.
So unless anybody else has any ideas, I've kind of got a bit of a back to basics answer, which is there's actually a surprising amount of free resources out there that kind of will educate you on sort of the basics, let's call them. That baseline, we talk a lot about risk. I think when you're not a security person, that actually in itself is a bit of a hurdle to get over, right? Like if you don't deal with risk every day and somebody goes, oh, well, just work out what your risks are. Actually, that can be very intimidating. And there's a lot of really good resources out there for just how do you approach that? What's the basic methodology? It's not even specific to OT, IoT, and that it's just, what are your assets? What are your threats? How likely is it that something will go wrong? And what's the impact? And from there, you kind of, it snowballs a little bit. And that is something that with a small organization, certainly in my experience, you can do with relatively little overhead, just to understand your position, not to do anything about it necessarily, but to understand your position. But from there, you are much more empowered to then make informed choices about what to actually spend that money on, how to do the basics. So that would be my advice.
I agree with you, Isabel. There are definitely things out there that can help you. There's an organization called the IoT Security Foundation that came out with in fact, we were part of that whole thing, and we still are. There's a gold sponsor in there. It's produced an assurance framework which gives vendors, it's free, you can go on and sign up and download this framework, and it gives you the ability to classify your device. I think it's like 4 classifications on the top of my head, different levels of classification of a device, from not low risk, not really that important type level security requirement, all the way up to high risk, right? This things don't, it's like a nuclear site type thing. And then you can, through the tools that I have, whistle out what type of controls you need to have in place on the devices in your applications, then figure out from there what I need to do from a risk posture point of view and how to mitigate that risk from putting some of these controls in place. And that's all stuff you can go online and get today.
Yeah, and I'll say security is way cheaper than not security. So as we talk about how much it costs to get off the ground, and I'll say it is affordable to bake security in as part of your project processes, to define those risk requirements. If you do it ahead of time, it's much more affordable than doing it after the fact. But the fact remains is a 6 months after a malware event or a ransomware event, the average company's out of business. They've closed their doors forever. They never open up. Malware attacks or ransomware attacks are costing north of $1 million. If they think you're a industry that has lots of money, they charge more for it. So not securing your devices looks cheap. It really, on your balance books, not securing your devices looks very, very, very cheap. In real world in the real world, it starts to cost you a whole lot more. So how do you go about doing it affordably? Automation, automation, automation. Like Rob from Jitsuin talked about, that automated platform that's letting you know about vulnerabilities. Make sure that every dollar that you spend in security is a smart dollar that closes off the security requirements that you have in front of you. The first 80% of security is relatively inexpensive. Going from 80% secure to 100% secure, it gets very expensive, but everyone can get to 80 at a low cost. And things that we're talking about today, that 80% it's having that SBOM being in there, having an understanding of the risks that are on your devices, putting it in smart locations on the network so that it can't compromise other areas and it's limited. Smart design is really not all that expensive.
I think that there is no such thing as 100% security. It's an unachievable goal. And, if you're looking at this from a risk-based perspective, then, you always have to look at secure against what. What is the threat? What's the risk of this thing going wrong? What's the impact? And that defines how much time and effort you spend in securing that device. And that risk always sits with the user of the device. So it's understanding what the device is going to be used for. And that's pretty difficult in connected device landscapes, where you don't know what that, as a manufacturer, you don't know what that user is going to use that device for up front. So how do you build a secure device not knowing what it's going to be used for at the end? And that's a very difficult problem to solve.
Yeah.
And I think the closest I've seen certainly is really where people are defining the use cases that they're expecting and kind of having a bit of a caveat saying like, oh, if you use something else, then good luck. Which, I don't know how much more, at least then that gives the consumer the information that they need to make an informed choice about using that system. Hey, I know I'm using it for something different. I'm using it differently in this specific way. Maybe then the user can design mitigating controls. But I think that first kind of communication from the manufacturers of I've designed it to be used in this particular way.
Well, this is where the SBOM comes in to help, because actually now you can say, well, here's the software bill of materials. This is the list of ingredients I've put into this device. You tell me if that's good for you. Yeah. Because one of the reasons for building a software bill of materials is so that the buyers of software and devices can make an informed decision as to whether that is going to be okay for them or not. So the first step is that transparency, and being upfront about what's included.
It's interesting when we all talk about cost here, and security obviously always comes at a cost, right? You have to pay money to put security in the end products, but ultimately you need to think about it from the end goal right here. What is it going to cost you if you don't put it in, right? What's it going to cost you if you have a cyber attack on a bunch of stuff and it's cause injury or fatality. And I mean, I'll give you an example around this as well. There's various programs out there to date looking at, improving the cybersecurity landscape for various different sectors. I mean, one of them from an automotive standpoint, I know that the UK, there's a future of transport review undergoing right now, which is looking at things like a consultation, basically looking at for industry players to give some input around what do we need to do from a future automotive landscape around cybersecurity, right? Improving compliance and safety in that automotive space. And one of the things I did note on that, some of the proposals there, is to enforce by the Secretary of Transport a recall to be done if a vehicle is found to be unsafe because there haven't been right security controls put in place. So you can imagine you've got these thousands of devices out there. If all of a sudden there's a vulnerability found, recall we go, back to the site, back to the service station. We need to update these things because the Secretary of State has said that we have to do this. Just as one example, right? So,
I mean, it gets really interesting when you factor in things like autonomous vehicles and machine learning. What are the machines learning from? Who's teaching them? They're going about their daily lives and learning behaviors and adapting to their environment. Are they learning the right things? Are they going to be doing ethical things? Should these machines be taken off the road and their driving licenses revoked if they start going bad? It gets really interesting to think about this.
Yeah, it gets very Asimov, really.
That's true.
Yeah, it's and I think it's interesting too. The AI, I think, is coming towards us, but most things being called AI are just machine learning today. Where I think we're a little ways away from true AI. I don't, maybe I'm wrong. Elon Musk seems to talk about it quite a bit, so maybe there's more to it than I've seen. But I think it's interesting, and so that brings, I think, the next really good question, and maybe we're starting to kind of, the questions aren't coming in as fast anymore, and a little bit of attendance dropping off. So I think I'll have everyone in this organization answer, or everyone on the board answer this one. But to you, what does IoT security look like in the future? What are we talking about 3 years from now? What problems have we solved or not solved? What do we do? How do we get from where we are today? What does that security look like? It could be the journey. What do you think the end goal is? What is the end state? So I'll pass it around to the group, and Isabel, you're on my left and on the top, so I'll go to you first.
Yeah, I mean, okay, it's a really difficult question to answer. What does the future look like? I guess in some ways, I'm going to answer what I want to answer as opposed to the real question. But what I would like, what I would like the future to look like in 3 years and 5 years' time, is that these ideas, these concepts around ownership and identity are just better answered. I think at the moment, a lot of people are kind of scrabbling around in the dark a little bit. There's a lot of unanswered questions. And what I hope happens is that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, that these things start to resolve into processes that really make sense and are practical and pragmatic, so that we do get to a position where it's really kind of solidly kind of manageable. And I think things like the executive orders are really contributing to it. But yeah, so that's whether it will happen in 3 years' time or not, I don't know, but that's what I would like to happen.
Good enough. Rob Dobson, you're on my left and down. I'm going around.
Yeah, no worries. So it's an interesting one, right? And I think IoT security has come a long way over the last sort of 5 or so years. When we first started in IoT security, 6 or so years ago, I mean, you talk about security in that sense, like what we're talking about, I don't need that stuff. But then now it's evolved, right? Because people become familiar with that actually these devices are connected to people sometimes, and they're doing really crazy stuff like assistive surgery, or they're attached to something in an industrial plant which can cause an explosion, and security has to be thought about there. And I think, as we've seen, legislation is evolving, is coming towards us, from a point of view that it's going to be mandated that certain things have to be put in place to prevent some of the cybersecurity attacks. And I think that will be an evolving thing. We've seen the last couple of years where some of the governments have come out with various things like the Executive Order and the SBOM zero trust requirements. So I think that will be a continuously evolving thing. And I think those that will win in that space will be the vendors that come out with products and services and solutions which have got a strong security posture. So I think it will help evolve the whole security landscape from that standpoint to build out stronger and secure products and services. So at least I see that happening now, and hopefully we'll see that come through. I guess I'm going to throw one out there before we get on to Rob. Is I'm waiting to see what happens from a cybersecurity standpoint in the metaverse.
Well, what was it? That NFT portal just had some $3 million stolen through phishing campaigns.
Yes.
What Coinbase or Ocean? I don't follow too much of that, but yeah, I think it's going to be interesting when you can have your entire meta house ransomware.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure what that would mean. Maybe you can sleep in someone else's VR house. I'm really not sure, but
let's keep things real.
Yeah.
Back in the real world with internet things. 3 years from now,
3, 5, 10, whatever, pick it. Your number.
I hope we're not talking about security, and we are talking about other things like zero trust things, and resilience, and continuous assurance. Because if we keep the conversation on make it secure and think it's once and done, then we're no further forward. We've got to have systems in place that are resilient and can adapt and fix things when they go wrong, because they will. They're only secure till they're not.
Yeah, and that hammers my point. My ultimate goal is that there's no such thing as a security job anymore. Ultimately put me out of work, hopefully right around retirement age. But not too much before that. I don't want to learn a new career at this point. But I point back to my world, and it's I pull from my previous experience. I'm a veteran of the United States Coast Guard, flag sitting behind me, and the Coast Guard has our motto, and lots of the military services have mottos. Ours is the less famous Semper motto. So the Marines are Semper Fidelis, always faithful. The Coast Guard is Semper Paratus, always ready. And in my future world it's a world that's ready for vulnerabilities. It's a world that admits that perfect code isn't written. And so we're ready for these vulnerabilities. We're ready because we're able to quickly take actions. We're ready because instead of it being a news story and people are panicking and security departments lose their jobs, it's, there's this new vulnerability and you poke a button on a script and things get updated and it's dealt with. My world really makes security irrelevant because we've done all the pre-work ahead of time to design security into the project. All of our projects are Semper Paratus. They're all ready. They're always ready to go out. They're always ready to be safe. They're always ready to deal with this environment that comes at them. What's the next big vulnerability? I don't know. Maybe it's going to be something that affects DNS ports, and instead of the NotPetya and those worlds that affected SMB, maybe it's going to be something that affects some weird ethereal port that everyone uses up high and there's some vulnerability, or it's the next Log4j. It's vulnerable across millions and millions of different devices. We have no idea what that next thing is going to be. So we've designed to be ready. We've designed Semper Paratus in mind. We're ready to deal with whatever situation comes our way, and it's not a security team that deals with it. These are IT issues. These are engineering issues. My whole work exists because things weren't engineered securely to start with. That's the only reason I have a job. And so eventually I hope I don't have a job anymore, which is kind of a weird way to put it. But yeah, so I want to say thank you to everyone who attended. Thank you, Isabel, Rob, and Rob. Hopefully we can split you guys up so I can not call Rob so many different times in the future, but it worked out great. I think it was a great presentation. Thank you, Industry IoT, for hosting us. Thank you everyone again I'm John Palvins with BSI, able and ready to help out on any OT, IoT type projects that you have come across your way. We deal with everything from tabletop awareness, cybersecurity awareness training in this OT, IoT environment, secure design, assessments, architecture assessments, engineering assessments. We can help you out across the whole gambit of projects that you're working on with OT and IoT. Hopefully I provided you enough information that you can see the value in that today. So with all of that said, thank you again, Device Authority, for joining us. Thank you again, Jitsuin, for joining us. And thank you, Isabel, of course, for joining us. Isabel didn't get into it, but she's a fantastically knowledgeable person in that cyber lab work. And hopefully we can highlight that a little bit more in the next presentation that we do, instead of just talking about assurance, because she knows way more than that. But with all of that, I'll pass it back over to you, Daniel.
Cheers, John. Thank you very much. And thank you for moderating today. Thank you, Isabel, Rob, for your contributions. We thought the presentation was great. There's been lots of comments in the chat about sharing the deck. Maybe you guys can create a version that we are able to share with the attendees, and we'll send that out on an email along with links to your websites and your email addresses, so you guys can continue the discussions. But originally we had planned for 2 hours, but the format changed slightly. But I think we got through all of the questions. So now is a good time to wrap up. So on behalf of Industry IoT, thank you guys. Thank you to all of the attendees for joining us today. And we'll send out a follow-up shortly.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Really good
See you
talk.
later.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.